Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Welcome back, wildlings, to part 2 of In the Hills, the Cities by Clive Barker. Now, the old organizer was dead and sorely missed. There was no disorganization in the streets without her. The people were far too disciplined for that, but they were already falling behind schedule, and it was almost 7:25. Nita's daughter had taken over in her mother's stead, but she lacked Nita's power to galvanize the people into action. She was, in a word, too gentle for the job in hand. It required a leader who was part prophet and part ringmaster, to coax and bully and inspire the citizens into their places. Maybe after 2 or 3 decades with a few more contests under her belt, Nita Obrenovich's daughter would make the grade, but today Potajevo was behindhand. Safety checks were being overlooked, nervous looks replaced the confidence of earlier years. Nevertheless, 6 minutes before 8, the first limb of Potajevo made its way out of the city to the assembly point to wait for its fellow. By that time, the flanks were already being lashed together in Popolak, and armed contingents were awaiting orders in the town square. Mick woke promptly at 7, though there was no alarm clock in their simply furnished room at the Hotel Beograd. He lay in his bed and listened to Judd's regular breathing from the twin bed across the room. A dull morning light whimpered through the thin curtains, not encouraging an early departure. After a few minutes, staring at the cracked paintwork on the ceiling and a while longer at the crudely carved crucifix on the opposite wall, Mick got up and went to the window. It was a dull day, as he had guessed. The sky was overcast and the roofs of Nova Pazar were gray and featureless in the flat morning light. But beyond the roofs, to the east, he could see the hills. There was sun there. He could see the shafts of light catching the blue-green of the forest, inviting a visit to their slopes. Today, maybe they would go south to Kosovska Mitrovica. There was a market there, wasn't there? And a museum? And they could drive down the valley of the Ibar, following the road beside the river where the hills rose wild and shining on either side. The hills. Yes, today he decided they would see the hills. It was 8:15. By 9, the main bodies of Popolak and Potajevo were substantially assembled. In their allotted districts, the limbs of both cities were ready and waiting to join their expectant torsos. Vaslav Jalovsek capped his gloves over his eyes and surveyed the sky. The cloud base had risen in the last hour, no doubt of that, and there were breaks in the clouds to the west, even, on occasion, a few glimpses of the sun. It wouldn't be a perfect day for the contest, perhaps, but certainly adequate. Mick and Judd breakfasted late on Hemendeks, roughly translated as ham and eggs, and several cups of good black coffee. It was brightening up even in Nova Pazar, and their ambitions were set high. Kosovska Mitrovica by lunchtime, and maybe a visit to the hill castle of Zvekan in the afternoon. About 9:30, they motored out of Nova Pazar and took the Srbovec road south to the Ibar Valley. Not a good road, but the bumps and potholes couldn't spoil the new day. The road was empty except for the occasional pedestrian, and in place of the maize and cornfields they'd passed on the previous day, the road was flanked by undulating hills whose sides were thickly and darkly forested. Apart from the few birds, they saw no wildlife. Even their infrequent traveling companions petered out altogether after a few miles, and the occasional farmhouse they drove by appeared locked and shuttered up. Black pigs ran unattended in the yards, with no children to feed them. Washing snapped and billowed on sagging lines with no washerwomen in sight. At first, this solitary journey through the hills was refreshing in its lack of human contact, but as the morning drew on, an uneasiness grew in them. Shouldn't we have seen a signpost to Mitrovica, Mick? He peered at the map. Maybe we've taken the wrong road. Well, if there'd been a sign, I'd have seen it. I think we should try to get off this road, bear south a bit more, meet the valley closer to Mitrovica than we'd planned. Well, how do we get off this bloody road? There have been a couple of turnings. Those are dirt tracks. Well, it's either that, or we go on the way we are. Judd pursed his lips. Cigarette? He asked. We finished them, miles back. In front of them, the hills formed an impenetrable line. There was no sign of life ahead, no frail wisp of chimney smoke, no sound of voice or vehicle. All right, said Judd, we take the next turning. Anything's better than this. They drove on. The road was deteriorating rapidly, potholes becoming craters, the hummocks feeling like bodies beneath the wheels. Then, there! A turning, and not just that, but a palpable turning. Not a major road, certainly, in fact, barely the dirt track that Judd had described the other roads as being, but it was an escape from the endless perspective of the road they were trapped on. This is becoming a bloody safari, said Judd as the VW began to bump and grind its way along the doleful little track. Where's your sense of adventure? I forgot to pack it. They were beginning to climb now as the track wound its way up into the hills. The forest closed over them, blotting out the sky, so a shifting patchwork of light and shadow scooted over the bonnet as they drove. There was birdsong suddenly, vacuous and optimistic, and a smell of new pine and undug earth. A fox crossed the track up ahead and watched a long moment as the car grumbled up towards it. Then, with the leisurely stride of a fearless prince, it sauntered away into the trees. Wherever they were going, Mick thought, this was better than the road that they'd left. Soon, maybe, they'd stop and walk a while to find a promontory from which they could see the entire valley, even Nova Pazar nestled behind them. The two men were still an hour's drive from Popolok when the head of the contingent at last marched out of the town square and took up its position with the main body. This last exit left the city completely deserted. Not even the sick or the old were neglected this day. No one was to be denied the spectacle and the triumph of the contest. Every single citizen, however young or infirm, the blind, the crippled, babies in arms, pregnant women, all made their way up from their proud city into the stamping ground. It was the law that they should attend, but this law needed no enforcing. No citizen of either city would have missed the chance to see that sight, to experience the thrill of the contest. The confrontation had to be total, city against city. This was the way it had always been. So the cities went up into the hills. By noon they were gathered, the citizens of Popolok and Podujevo, in the secret well of the hills, hidden from civilized eyes, to do ancient and ceremonial battle. Tens of thousands of hearts beat faster. Tens of thousands of bodies stretched and strained and sweated as the twin cities took their positions. The shadows of the bodies darkened tracts of land the size of small towns. The weight of their feet trampled the grass to a green milk. Their movement killed animals, crushed bushes, and threw down trees. The earth literally reverberated to their passage, the hills echoing with the booming din of their steps. In the towering body of Podujevo, a few technical hitches were becoming apparent. A slight flaw in the knitting of the left flank had resulted in a weakness there, and there were consequent problems in the swiveling mechanisms of the hips. It was stiffer than it should be, and the movements were not quite as smooth. As a result, there was considerable strain being put upon that region of the city. It was being dealt with bravely. After all, the contest was intended to press the contestants to their limits. But the breaking point was closer than anyone would have dared to admit. The citizens were not as resilient as they had been in previous contests. A bad decade for crops had produced bodies less well-nourished, spines less supple, wills less resolute. The badly knitted flank might not have caused an accident in and of itself, but further weakened by the frailty of the competitors, it set a scene for death on an unprecedented scale. They stopped the car. "Did you hear that?" Mick shook his head. His hearing hadn't been good since he was an adolescent. Too many rock shows had blown his eardrums to hell. But Judd got out of the car. The birds were quieter now. The noise that he'd heard as they drove came again, and it wasn't simply a noise. It was almost a motion in the earth, a roar that seemed seated in the substance of the hills themselves. Thunder, was it? No, too rhythmical. It came again through the soles of his feet. Boom! Mick heard it this time. He leaned out of the car window. "It's up ahead somewhere. I heard it." "I hear it now," Judd nodded. Boom. The earth thunder sounded again. "What the hell is that?" said Mick. "Whatever it is, I want to see it." Judd got back into the Volkswagen, smiling. "It almost sounds like guns," he said, starting the car. "Big guns." Through his Russian-made binoculars, Vaslav Jalovsek watched the starting official raise his pistol. He saw the feather of white smoke rise from the barrel, and a second later heard the sound of the shot across the valley. The contest had begun. He looked up at the twin towers of Popolak and Podojevo. Heads in the clouds? Well, almost. They practically stretched to touch the sky. It was an awesome sight. A breath-stopping, sleep-stabbing sight. Two cities swaying and writhing and preparing to take their first steps toward each other in this ritual battle. Of the two, Podojevo seemed the less stable. There was a slight hesitation as the city raised its left leg to begin its march. Nothing serious, just a little difficulty coordinating the hip and thigh muscles. A couple of steps and the city would find its rhythm, a couple of more and its inhabitants would be moving as one creature, one perfect giant set to match its grace and power against its mirror image. The gunshots sent flurries of birds up from the trees that banked the hidden valley. They rose up in celebration of the great contest, chattering their excitement as they swooped over the stamping ground. "Did you hear a shot just now?" asked Judd. Mick nodded. Military exercises?" Judd's smile had broadened. He could see the headlines already. Exclusive reports of secret maneuvers in the depths of the Yugoslavian countryside. Russian tanks, perhaps. Tactical exercises being held out of the West's prying sight. With luck, he would be the carrier of this news. Boom. Boom. The birds were in the air. The thunder was loud now. And it did sound like guns. "It's over the next ridge," said Judd. "I don't think we should go any further." "Well, I have to see." "I don't. We're not supposed to be here." "I don't see any signs." "They'll cart us away, deport us. I don't know, I just think..." Boom! "I've got to see." The words were scarcely out of his mouth when the screaming started. Podojevo was screaming. A death cry. Someone buried in the weak flank had died of the strain and had begun a chain of decay in the system. One man loosed his neighbor, and that neighbor loosed his, spreading a cancer of chaos through the body of the city. The coherence of the towering structure deteriorated with terrifying rapidity as the failure of one part of the anatomy put an unendurable pressure on every other. "Did you hear that?" The masterpiece that the good citizens of Podojevo had constructed of their own flesh and blood tottered, and then, a dynamited skyscraper, it began to fall. The broken flank spewed citizens like a slashed artery, spitting blood. Then, with a graceful sloth that made the agonies of the citizens all the more horrible, it bowed toward the earth, all its limbs dissembling as it fell. The huge head that had brushed the clouds so recently was flung back on its thick neck. 10,000 mouths spoke a single scream for its vast mouth. A wordless, infinitely pitiable appeal to the sky, a howl of loss, a howl of anticipation, a howl of puzzlement. How, that scream demanded, could the day of days end like this, a welter of falling bodies? It was unmistakably human, though almost deafeningly loud. Judd's stomach convulsed. He looked across at Mick, who was white as a sheet. Judd stopped the car. "No," said Mick. "Listen, for Christ's sake!" The din of dying moans, appeals, and imprecations flooded the air. It was very close. "We've got to go on now," Mick implored. Judd simply shook his head. He was prepared for whatever military spectacle. All the Russian army massed over the next hill, but that noise in his ears was the noise of human flesh, too human for words. It reminded him of his childhood imaginings of hell, the endless, unspeakable torment his mother had threatened him with if he failed to embrace Christ. It was a terror that he'd forgotten for 20 years, but suddenly here it was again, fresh-faced. Maybe the pit itself gaped over that next horizon, with his mother standing at its lip, inviting him to taste its punishments. Well, if you won't drive, I will. People seem to forget that sometimes, no matter how literally connected a collective may be, it's all just a group of people. And when something goes wrong for one person, that can spread horribly, horribly quickly. Join us next time for part 3 of In the Hills, the Cities. And until then, stay scary, wildlings, and make the most of your nights.